Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome to another slow descent into the strange corners of the past. Tonight, let's take a step into a world where brushing too close to a fire could doom your soul, where trimming your nails wasn't hygiene, it was cosmic warfare, and where the air was thick with incense, silence, and unspoken fear of disorder. This isn't Game of Thrones or some mystical fiction. No, this was just a Tuesday in ancient Persia. Close your eyes if you haven't already. You're in a palace. The walls are carved with lion hunts and gods. Torches flicker against polished stone. You hear merchants whispering in half-familiar tongues. Greek, Aramaic, Old Persian, while peacock feathers rustle in the hands of sweaty diplomats trying to look elegant. You're not royalty. You're not a servant. You're something far more dangerous. You're an observer. And the Persians? They have no idea how strange they look to you. At the center of it all, blazing like a small sun in a brass cauldron, is the sacred fire. It's not just a light source. It's not decor. This fire is everything. It's pure, eternal, divine. It's the spiritual backbone of the empire. To extinguish it would be a catastrophe, the kind of thing that sends priests into panicked chanting and might make someone lose their head. You sneeze. Just a little one. A tickle in the nose, nothing major. But here, in this room, beside that fire, your sneeze might as well be a thunderclap. Heads turn. A priest glares, his hand tightening on a bundle of myrtle twigs. You've just flirted with cosmic disaster. Welcome to the Zoroastrian worldview, where purity and order weren't just spiritual ideals, they were the very fabric of reality. And you? You're walking chaos in sandals. Now, let's be clear, this wasn't about being clean, in the modern sense. You couldn't just wipe a counter and call it a day. The Persians believed that everything in the universe was at war. Asher, truth, order, cleanliness, versus Drowsy, lies, filth, chaos. And everyday life was a minefield of invisible traps. That crusty bit of bread under your bed? Demonic. The hair on your comb? A spiritual threat. A nail clipping on the floor? You might as well light a signal fire for the demons of corruption to come marching in. Hair, by the way, was a problem, not in the way you think. In our world, shedding a strand or two is mildly annoying, maybe a little gross. In ancient Persia, it was borderline sacrilegious. Every fallen hair was considered nasu, ritually impure, part of the same spiritual contamination as a rotting corpse. If your hair landed too close to a sacred fire, it wasn't just a bad day. It could undo blessings, invite illness, and offend the gods. Imagine parenting in that world. Pick up your nail clippings or you'll unleash cosmic disorder and doom our entire lineage. Honestly, it kind of makes clean your room or else sound charmingly mild. The fear of disorder ran so deep, it seeped into every corner of daily life. The sacred fires were tended with obsession. They were watched, guarded, never allowed to flicker too low or smoke too thick. Priests didn't just babysit the fire, they practically married it. One rogue ash on the wrong surface, and people were sent through purification rituals that make modern detox smoothies look like casual tea time. This obsession wasn't limited to the clergy either. Ordinary Persians lived under a spiritual microscope, constantly evaluating themselves for signs of contamination. And if something impure crept into your space, be it a dead insect, a few stray hairs, or even the breath of someone mourning the dead, you were suddenly on the wrong side of cosmic law. So, what did they do? They burned it, or buried it, carefully, not too close to fire, not too close to water. Everything had rules. The logic was airtight in their minds, even if it feels like a fever dream to us. Grooming wasn't about beauty. It was about preventing metaphysical collapse. Now take a moment to think about your own routines. A hot shower, a bit of soap, maybe a shave or a little deodorant. You probably don't wonder whether your loofah has offended Ahura Mazda, but the Persians did. Every single act of cleanliness was a ritual negotiation with the divine. The act of clipping your nails, for example, involved more than just a quick trim. The cuttings had to be collected, stored, and disposed of in ways that wouldn't risk contact with sacred spaces or living beings. Some texts even described specific burial sites for hair and nails, almost like little tombs for dead pieces of you. each fragment carrying the potential to invite chaos if left unmanaged. But perhaps the strangest part? It worked. Their empire flourished. Gardens bloomed in deserts. Roads stretched across continents. They didn't just survive, they dominated. While the Greeks mocked them for being soft, overly mystical, or superstitious, Persia endured. And if that required a little ritual obsession, a bit of bull urine, we'll get to that later, or the occasional tongue-burning trial, so be it. To the ancient Persians, order was life, and life meant guarding purity with every breath, every grooming habit, every misplaced strand of hair. And when you think about it, isn't there something oddly comforting about that level of control? In a chaotic world, they drew a hard line. Fire was sacred, hair was dangerous. And you'd better not sneeze too close to a flame. Nail clippings safely buried, your sneeze forgiven, the fire still roaring softly. But here's the thing, that fire, it wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't like lighting a candle to set a mood. In Persia, fire was divine presence, living, watching, judging. It could not be contaminated. It could not be ignored. And above all, it could not be extinguished. Priests didn't sleep much. These weren't your average ceremonial figures who showed up on holidays and waved some incense around. These were elite guardians, spiritual engineers maintaining the balance of the cosmos, one flame at a time. They watched that fire day and night, fed it with clean, dry wood, stirred it just so, and protected it like you'd protect a newborn baby made of sunlight and judgment. And that fire, it judged. Not metaphorically, literally. You could be tried before it. If you were accused of lying or theft, you might be told to swear innocence near the fire. Or worse, touch a metal plate superheated in its flame. Survive unscathed, innocent. Get burned, guilty. Divine trial by barbecue. And yet, for Persians, this made perfect sense. In a world where truth and cleanliness were the same thing, where lies and dirt both threatened the cosmic order, why wouldn't fire be the ultimate judge? It couldn't be fooled. It didn't lie. And if you offended it, you'd better start preparing your soul for a long afterlife of spiritual pest control. Let's zoom out for a moment. To us modern folks, with our fluoride toothpaste and 3-in-1 shampoo bottles, Persia's obsession might sound theatrical, maybe even paranoid. But context matters. These people lived in a world without soap, without refrigeration, without germ theory. And yet, they managed to create one of the most advanced, stable, and surprisingly hygienic societies of the ancient world. In fact, Persian hygiene laws, though framed as religious rituals, often aligned with things we now understand as health science. Avoid corpses? Smart. Dispose of waste carefully? Very smart. Keep sacred spaces free from decay and rot. Practically an ancient version of biohazard control, only they wrapped it in divine logic, into the ritual of purification. Let's say, just hypothetically, you accidentally brushed against a corpse, or perhaps you got too close to someone who had. You didn't need a bath. You needed a spiritual reset, and this wasn't a quick splash of water and a prayer. No, this was the full bull urine package. Yes, you heard me. Bull urine, called gomez, was the star ingredient in a ritual purification process that makes modern spa detoxes look tame. Stored in jars, treated as sacred, and applied with precision, gomez was used in multiple cycles of cleansing, often in odd-numbered sequences. 3 times, then 9, maybe even 21. The belief? Odd numbers carried spiritual strength. Each wash had to be accompanied by specific chants, pronounced perfectly. Miss a syllable, skip a line, miscount your cycles, and the ritual failed. You'd have to start over. Imagine going to confession and having to redo the whole thing because you said blessings instead of grace. Only now you're wet, reeking of bull, and the priest is staring at you like you're the reason demons have a foothold in this dimension. And that priest? He's not bored. He's sweating. He's focused. He knows that your failure is his failure, that the stain of impurity, if left unresolved, could ripple outward into the community. These weren't metaphors to the Persians. They believed that cosmic filth was contagious, a spiritual virus that could infect people, places, tools, even ideas. The moment you touched something impure, it wasn't just about you. Your clothes, your house, even the bowl you ate from, All became suspect, and that's where the fear lived, not just in the rituals themselves, but in the fragility of purity. One mistake, one drop of contaminated Gomez in the wrong basin, one poorly timed chant, and the whole web unraveled. And the fire? Always watching. Priests carried embers from sacred fire to sacred fire, ensuring continuity. No fire was allowed to die a natural death. If a flame flickered too low, they'd relight it from another pure source. In essence, Persia maintained a living network of fire, a kind of spiritual power grid, burning across temples and cities, each flame a tiny sun upholding universal order. People whispered near fire. Children were taught to never point, never breathe too hard, never throw anything near it, not even crumbs. Fire was the eye of God, and God didn't like crumbs. And maybe you're thinking, surely not everyone bought into this. But here's the surprising part. They did. Not just priests, not just nobles, but ordinary people. Bakers, herdsmen, caravan drivers. They lived within this framework not just because they were forced to, but because it provided meaning, structure, a way to understand suffering, a way to fight invisible enemies with visible rituals. And when things went wrong, when plagues came or crops failed, they didn't look for bacteria. They looked for impurity. Someone had broken a rule. Someone had left a clipping unburied. Someone had disrespected the sacred flame. And that's how societies endure. Not always by being right, but by being coherent. Chapter 2. Justice by Fire, Metal and Mutilation. Let's drift a little deeper now, not into gardens or temples, but into the darker corridors of Persian justice, the alleyways behind gold-threaded tapestries, and the polished halls of power. Here, justice didn't come softly wrapped in philosophy or courtroom etiquette. It came seared in metal, soaked in fear, and cloaked in rituals that made every judgment feel like divine theatre. In ancient Persia, law wasn't just the will of the king, it was the preservation of cosmic order, and the tools for that preservation were not balanced scales or reasoned arguments, they were fire, mutilation, and spectacle. To lie in Persia was not a matter of dishonesty, it was a metaphysical crime. It wasn't just a break in trust, it was a tear in the fabric of reality. Truth, or Asher, was considered the spine of the universe. A single falsehood didn't just harm relationships, it threatened harmony itself. And so justice became a weapon in defense of the cosmos. Trials weren't so much about determining facts as they were about flushing out the forces of chaos hiding in human skin. The accused weren't just suspects, they were potential conduits for the demonic. Imagine the scene. You're standing in a crowded courtyard, the heat of the day rising in waves from the stone. A man has been accused of theft. There are no papers, no closing arguments, no slow deliberation. The priest approaches with a copper bowl glinting in the sun. Inside, a small lump of molten metal shimmers alive, hungry. The accused is instructed to stick out his tongue. If he's innocent, Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, will protect him. If he's guilty, the metal will scold him. Not because of physics, but because fire pure and sacred knows the truth. This was the famed ordeal of molten metal, and it was real. The crowd watches, not with bloodlust, but with solemnity. To them, this is not cruelty. It's purification. A guilty tongue, blistered and black, confirms that Drowsy, the force of deception, has been exposed. A clean tongue, though rare, is a divine declaration of truth. In a land where lying equaled spiritual disease, fire was not punishment, it was diagnosis. But not all punishments were so abstract. Some were blunt, brutal, and utterly unforgettable. A thief might have his ears removed, not just as retribution, but as a visual warning to others. These weren't hidden mutilations. They were meant to be seen. A traitor might be walled alive, bricks stacked slowly around him while crowds whispered prayers or curses. A liar who survived judgment might still be paraded through streets, his confession shouted by criers, his shame immortalized in dust and voice. These were not just penalties, they were performances. Public theatre turned divine instruction, and the logic extended far beyond guilt. Punishment was prevention. Pain wasn't doled out simply because someone had broken a law. It was issued to burn the lesson into the minds of others. The idea was that if everyone saw what chaos looked like, saw it punished, silenced, erased, they would remain loyal to order, to cleanliness, to Asher. Justice in ancient Persia wasn't designed to rehabilitate, it was designed to cleanse, and in doing so, it wrapped itself around the Zoroastrian obsession with purity. You weren't punished just for what you did, you were punished for what you disturbed. Disharmony was contagion, and courts were the spiritual front line. But this system wasn't just about burning tongues and brick traitors. Sometimes, justice came quietly through oaths and firelight. Instead of ordeal, you might be told to swear your innocence before a sacred flame. No pain, no scars, just your voice, your vow, and the belief that if you lied, the fire would mark you eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The community watched, the priest listened, and everyone waited. If sickness befell you later, if your crops failed or your child fell ill, it would be known the fire had judged. This trust in divine judgment replaced investigation. Suspicion alone could result in punishment, and innocence wasn't protected by evidence, it was proved by enduring torment without cracking. If that sounds terrifying, that's because it was. But it also worked, at least within its own logic. The fear of being falsely accused was matched only by the fear of being rightly found guilty. Still, not every corner of Persia followed the same rituals. In urban centres like Susa or Persepolis, a growing bureaucracy meant that contracts, written testimony, and administrative records became part of the legal process. But even these were underpinned by oaths and spiritual accountability. You could write your innocence into a scroll, but you still had to swear it before a flame. Justice wasn't isolated from religion. The court was an extension of the temple. Priests often acted as both judges and intermediaries. Trials weren't about what was logical. They were about what was spiritually correct. And when justice was done, it wasn't framed as an outcome. It was framed as a restoration. A world knocked out of balance had been pushed back into its groove. Of course, not every punishment was fair. The powerful could manipulate outcomes. The poor bore the brunt. Justice, like all things, had cracks, but belief kept it together. And belief is a powerful thing. The people feared lies, not because they were unethical, but because they were corrosive. One dishonest word could invite illness, famine, invasion. So people told the truth. Or, at the very least, they learned to fear the consequences of failing to perform truth. In that world, fire was more than a tool. It was a witness. Pain wasn't just a side effect. It was proof. And the legal system wasn't designed to protect your rights. It was designed to protect reality itself. And so the fires burned, the trials continued, and Persia endured. It endured because it believed that chaos could be spotted, judged, and erased. It endured because people watched each other's behaviour, not just as neighbours, but as stewards of cosmic balance. And it endured because every tongue that touched hot metal whispered one thing above all: truth or silence. You might think that the fear of fire or mutilation would be enough to keep a society in check, but ancient Persia didn't stop there. They didn't just punish, they orchestrated punishment. Each public spectacle was a calculated event, designed not only to penalise the guilty, but to shape the minds of everyone watching. Justice wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was performed under open skies for everyone to witness, to absorb, to remember. And in that visibility was the true machinery of control. Walk with me into one of those squares. It could be at the city gates, in a bustling market, or in the shaded court just beyond a noble's home. The air is heavy with heat and anticipation. You can smell cumin, dust, and the sweat of 100 nervous onlookers. Today, a man is going to be punished. Not killed, not exiled, but made into a message. His crime? Treason. Not in the way we use the word today. He wasn't leaking state secrets or plotting a rebellion. He merely spoke against the king's steward, accused him of overtaxing villagers. That was enough. The accusation, regardless of truth, carried the scent of insubordination. And in Persia, even assent was dangerous. So he stands now, back pressed against the gap between two unfinished walls. Masons are called, but not with stone or architecture in mind. Slowly, deliberately, they begin to lay bricks around him. No rush, no drama, just the cold, methodical construction of a punishment. One brick at a time, the space around his body disappears. First the legs, then the arms, then the chest. His face is left exposed, because cruelty without visibility is meaningless. People must see his fear, his regret, his slow resignation. When only his eyes remain, the priests begin to chant. When his mouth is covered, the workers step back. And when at last he is silent and sealed, the crowd is dismissed. Some walk away uneasy, some whisper, but all remember. And that memory is the point. This form of punishment, bricking a man alive, was rare but real, reserved for traitors, oath-breakers, or those whose disobedience threatened the fragile architecture of divine order. It was horrifying, yes, but it was also strangely consistent with Persian ideas of impurity. The guilty weren't simply removed, they were contained, buried within the very structures they had defied. No blood was spilled, no bones left to bury, just a body inside a wall, a warning stitched into stone. Other punishments were more immediate. The loss of ears, nose or fingers might follow theft or deception, not for cruelty's sake, but for labelling. Maimed faces were living records of misdeeds, visible to all. You didn't need to keep court transcripts. You simply looked at a man's face and read his past. It was a form of civic memory carved into flesh. And yet, these harsh penalties didn't arise from sadism. They emerged from fear of disorder. For Persians, disorder wasn't inconvenience. It was death. A universe out of alignment would bring famine, war, plague. And if harshness was the price of balance, then harshness was holy. But not all suffering came from punishment. Sometimes, just being accused was enough. A man who swore falsely and was later struck with illness became a cautionary tale. A woman whose family suffered misfortune after her denial in court was silently judged by her neighbours. The community acted as an extension of the court, observing, remembering, deciding who was touched by divine retribution. You didn't need to be found guilty in the moment. You just needed to be watched long enough for the gods to weigh in. This allowed justice to extend its reach far beyond the palace walls. Villagers monitored each other. Priests reported to administrators. And fear, subtle, patient, always watching, did what no bureaucracy could. It disciplined without lifting a hand. It's important to understand how deeply this worldview was tied to religion. Zoroastrianism wasn't a backdrop to Persian law, it was its foundation. Its central dualism, Asher versus Druj, order versus chaos, was the lens through which everything was seen. And so law was not just secular rule, it was spiritual war. Every judgment was a battle between light and darkness. Every punishment, a ritual cleansing. Every confession, a small sacrifice to realign the stars. And in this war, the fire never slept. Sacred fires, kept burning in temples and courtrooms alike, were the eternal witnesses. Oaths sworn beside them carried more weight than any written contract. To lie in their glow was to invite doom. People believed the fire would reveal deception through illness, death, drought. And so even when courts faltered, when judges were bribed or witnesses silenced, there remained the ultimate arbiter, divine consequence. The psychological impact of this system was immense. People lived in constant awareness, not just of laws, but of cosmic balance. One wrong word, one impurity, one misstep could ripple across reality. It trained them not only to behave, but to believe. And belief, especially when combined with fear, is the strongest control mechanism history has ever known. Punishments, then, were not simply responses. They were reinforcements. Ritualized performances that reminded everyone of their place, their obligations, their vulnerability. They were brutal, yes, but also effective. The Persian Empire, after all, didn't stretch from the Indus to the Aegean by accident. It was built on roads, yes, on trade, administration, gold, but it was also built on obedience. And obedience was taught through fire, flesh, and fear. And yet, strangely, there was a beauty in it too. A terrible, harsh kind of beauty. Because in its own way, Persian justice wasn't arbitrary. It was rooted in consistency, in symbolism, in a longing for universal order. It sought to protect, even if its methods horrify us now. And maybe that's the point. What feels grotesque to us was sacred to them. What we call cruelty, they called maintenance. A civilization surviving in a dangerous, unpredictable world had to choose between chaos and control. They chose control, and they wrapped it in fire, blood, and silence. So when you hear about ancient punishments, about walls swallowing men, tongues seared by metal, or crowds watching in quiet acceptance, don't look away in judgment. Look closer. See the fear, the faith, the structure beneath the brutality. See a people trying desperately to keep their world intact, even if it meant sealing someone inside a wall to do it, because to them justice wasn't justice unless it burned. Chapter 3. Death Without Touch. Towers, corpses, and cosmic contamination. Death, for many cultures, is a moment of finality, a ritual of grief, a farewell. But for the ancient Persians, death was just the beginning. Not of an afterlife, not even of mourning, but of contamination. The moment a human being took their final breath, their body no longer represented life. It represented danger. Immediate, invisible, cosmic danger. The kind that could seep through walls, infect the air, and unravel the balance of existence. You didn't just lose a loved one, you gained a spiritual emergency. To understand this, you have to forget everything you think you know about funerals. In ancient Persia, you didn't wash the body, you didn't bury it, you didn't even touch it. Touching the dead was, quite literally, unthinkable. It wasn't a matter of preference or tradition, it was law. Cosmic law. The corpse was impure. Nasu and Nasu wasn't just an idea. It was an entity, a force, a creeping corruption that had to be stopped before it spread. So what did they do with the dead? They carried them to towers. Not temples, not graveyards. Towers. Massive, circular stone structures. Bare, silent, rising out of the desert like drums placed on the earth by forgotten giants. These were the towers of silence, and they were not for the living. They were for the bones. Atop these towers, far above the earth, the dead were laid out in rings, men in one, women in another, children in a third. No coffins, no tombs, just sky, stone, and birds. Because the final step in the Persian death ritual wasn't a prayer, it was exposure. Nature, it was believed, had its own purifying agents. Chief among them, vultures. Silent, efficient, sacred scavengers who were more than just part of the cycle. They were part of the theology. The birds didn't desecrate the body, they completed it. By stripping flesh from bone, they cleansed it. They prevented the impure from entering the soil, the water, or the sacred flame. And make no mistake, these towers weren't hidden away. They loomed near cities, close enough to be seen but far enough to keep their silence. Families would bring the deceased only part way. The rest was handled by a special caste of corpse bearers. These weren't undertakers, they were ritual warriors, spiritual sanitation workers trained to walk the thin line between impurity and duty. They used iron stretchers, because iron, they believed, repelled demons. Even their tools had to be purified before and after each use. The corpse bearers didn't wear elaborate robes or speak grand eulogies. They moved efficiently, respectfully, distantly. Once the body was laid atop the tower, their job was done. They descended quickly, quietly, and returned through special routes to avoid contaminating public spaces. No one embraced them. No one invited them home for tea. They were respected, but not touched. The family, meanwhile, stayed far behind. Weeping was allowed. Mourning, too. But proximity? Never. Even the house where the person had died was now ritually impure. It had to be purified, fumigated, cleansed with sacred substances. Sometimes it was abandoned entirely. A death wasn't just a loss. It was a nuclear event, spiritually speaking. And the fallout? It could last days. Why so extreme? Because the Persians didn't see death as natural. They saw it as an intrusion, a crack in the order of things. Life was pure. Death was the enemy. And the moment a soul left its body, the space it vacated became vulnerable to the demonic force of decay. The only solution was ritual containment, and the rituals were meticulous. Every object that touched a corpse was cleansed. 3 times, then 9, always in odd numbers, believed to hold spiritual potency. The most feared contamination was not visual, it was invisible, seeping into tools, clothes, even memories. The wrong word spoken too close to the dead could, it was believed, attract Nasu's attention. And Nasu didn't whisper, it ruined. But perhaps the most bizarre element of all was the use of bull urine, or gomez. To us, it sounds like a strange joke, medieval, unhygienic, absurd. But to them, it was sacred. Stored in special vessels, used in strict cycles, applied with chanting and reverence, gomez was the most powerful weapon against corpse pollution. It didn't just clean, it purified. The ritual wasn't just physical, it was performative. Every drop had a purpose, every chant a barrier. Imagine the scene, a priest, voice trembling, repeating ancient verses as he washes a room with ashes and urine. He's not disgusted, he's focused, he's holding back the unraveling. The family watches, not with revulsion, but with relief. The room will be safe again, the balance will be restored. There was no room for error. Miscount a chant, start over. Spill a drop in the wrong direction, repeat the sequence. It was cosmic customer service, and the gods didn't accept sloppy work. Only perfection could keep the demons at bay. And it wasn't just people who could carry the taint. Animals that touched the corpse became suspect. Even objects, knives, bedding, clothes, could be declared ritually impure and destroyed. If your neighbor died and the wind shifted just right, you might need your own cleansing. That's how far the fear reached. To a modern mind, it's almost incomprehensible. But for the Persians, it was deeply logical. The world was fragile, order was rare, and the dead were dangerous. Even the way they stored the bones told a story. Once the vultures had done their work and the flesh was gone, the bones were gathered carefully with iron tongs and placed in ossuaries. Stone boxes, each one etched, stacked, sealed. Not buried, not burned, not forgotten. Preserved. Quiet. Contained. The soul had moved on. The impurity had been cleansed. What remained was memory and bone. And so, death became a ritual of boundaries. The dead here, the living there. No overlap, no sentimentality, no risk. It was not about honouring the body, it was about protecting the world from it. And yet, somehow, this harshness carried a strange compassion. It wasn't that Persians didn't love their dead, they did. But their love was shaped by fear, by theology, by a sense that even love must obey cosmic rules. They mourned, they wept, but they obeyed. Because to disobey meant to invite corruption, and to invite corruption meant to invite ruin. And so the towers stood, silent, watching, doing the work no one else could. And above them the birds circled, holy, tireless, eternal. Not just scavengers, but servants of order. And in the cities below, people lived their lives with care. They swept their thresholds. They whispered their prayers. They trimmed their nails and burned their hair. They guarded the fire, purified their homes, and waited for the day when they too would be carried up the winding path, laid upon the stone, and offered to the sky. Because in Persia, the dead weren't buried. They were neutralized. There was a reason the Persians built their towers of silence high and far, because the dead didn't just die in ancient Persia. They lingered, not as ghosts or spirits, but as contaminating echoes, as sources of unseen danger that crept into wood, fabric, soil, and even breath. To the modern mind, death is sad, sometimes solemn, sometimes beautiful. To them, it was sacred terror. The moment someone exhaled for the last time, every part of their world had to be audited, not out of cruelty, not even out of superstition, but because they believed the cosmos demanded it. The house where someone had died? Unclean. You didn't just light incense, you didn't pray and move on. You ritually cleansed it. Again and again, starting with the floor, the walls, the furniture, the tools. Not with soap, but with ashen bull urine and sacred chants. The priest didn't come to console. He came to inspect, to diagnose the spiritual infection that had taken hold of the space. And if it was too much, if the purification failed, you didn't argue, you abandoned the house. Yes, abandonment was part of the process. Entire homes were sometimes left behind because of a death. Families would pack their things and go, believing the space had become permanently vulnerable. You couldn't risk it. Not when a corpse could corrupt even the shadow of a room. The belief was absolute. Death left a residue, and residue drew demons. The utensils used in the person's final days were destroyed. Their bedding, burned. Clothes, cleansed or discarded. Anything they touched, combs, cups, mats, became suspicious. Even the air was suspect. It wasn't symbolic, it wasn't poetic, it was law. Cosmic law, inscribed not by kings but by the universe itself, enforced through ritual, fear, and generations of habit. And yet, there was an eerie beauty to it, a kind of quiet grace in how methodical it all was. Every step had purpose. Nothing was improvised. Rituals had to be done in exact cycles, 3 times, 9 times, always odd numbers. Why? Because odd numbers were sacred. They broke symmetry. They symbolized spiritual dynamism. And in a world where evil sought balance to slip in unnoticed, imbalance, intentional, precise imbalance, was a shield. Washing wasn't about getting clean. It was about breaking the chain of impurity. Each round of cleansing was accompanied by prayers. Ancient words passed down through firelight and whispered in tones of deep concentration. The priest could not stumble, could not pause in the wrong place. One error, and the entire sequence had to be restarted. Imagine washing the same floor 3 times while murmuring chants you've known since childhood. Imagine reaching the final verse and forgetting a syllable. Start again, not out of perfectionism, out of fear. This wasn't fanaticism, it was maintenance. To the Persians, the world was a fragile mechanism of purity and order. It needed constant tuning. Rituals weren't extravagance, they were upkeep, like oiling a clock or tending a flame. Miss a ritual, and the gears might jam, the demons might slip through. It extended to people, too. If you touched a corpse directly or indirectly, you had to be purified. You couldn't just rinse your hands. You were ritually contaminated. You weren't allowed near sacred spaces. You couldn't participate in ceremonies. You might even be socially avoided until your cleansing was complete. Purification involved a full cycle. Urine washes, ash rubbings, dry fasting, and at times, public declaration of one's impurity followed by formal restoration. You didn't hide your condition. You acknowledged it, worked through it, and was slowly brought back into the fold. And this cycle didn't just apply to physical death. It applied to symbolic death too. Contact with rot, with decay, with anything that hinted at the edge of life invited the same scrutiny. But above all, it was the corpse that anchored the dread. It wasn't feared for its grotesqueness. It was feared for its energy, the way it shifted the balance of things. Even tools were handled with care. The stretchers used to carry the dead were made of iron not because it was strong, but because it was believed to repel spiritual contamination. Iron was protective, sacred. The same tongs used to collect bones were stored separately, purified frequently. They were never used for anything else. Even the wind was a factor. If the wind blew from the tower toward the village, people closed their doors. The very idea of impurity carried weight, and with it, obligation. What's fascinating is how this mindset rippled through Persian identity. The empire wasn't just a political machine, it was a spiritual project. Every road, every garden, every market was part of a cosmic defense strategy. Keeping decay at bay meant keeping chaos at bay. And chaos, to them, wasn't a metaphor. It was real. It had names, faces, forces. This attitude even shaped architecture. Homes were designed to allow airflow that would not carry impurity indoors. Water sources were built with sacred protections. Wells were watched for signs of contamination. If an animal died in one, it wasn't simply removed. Priests were summoned. Rituals performed. Water declared unsafe until properly cleansed. Because even water life-giving, holy, could betray you if you weren't vigilant. And let's return to the bones. After the vultures did their work on the tower, bones were gathered and stored in ossuaries. Stone boxes, sometimes carved, often plain, always respected. These were not graves. They were containers, designed to hold what remained without polluting the world. Placement mattered. Orientation mattered. The ossuary was not merely storage, it was containment. And containment, in this case, meant survival. The towers themselves became part of the landscape, silent, necessary, a permanent reminder that death was never far, and that even in death you owed something to the world you left behind. You owed obedience to a system that protected the living. You owed your bones to the priests, your flesh to the birds, your echo to the rituals that would keep others safe. To modern ears this sounds cold, mechanical, even cruel. But to the Persians it was devotion, love expressed as caution, grief wrapped in law. They didn't fear the dead because they hated them. They feared the dead because they understood them, as vessels of transformation, as doors that, once opened, let something else in. And so they took no chances. They followed every rule. They counted every prayer. They washed and burned and whispered and waited. They feared not death, but the ripple it left, the echo, the soft footprint of imbalance. In the end, what you see is a civilization that cared deeply about its own fragility, not in weakness, but in reverence. Theirs was a system built on vigilance, shaped by fear, but held together by belief that the world could stay pure, if only you followed the right steps, avoided the wrong hands, and always respected the fire. Because in Persia, life was precious, but order was sacred. Chapter 4. Divine Water and the Law of Rivers. How Persia turned streams into sanctuaries. You've walked with the Persians through fire. You've watched their justice burn into flesh, their dead carried to the sky, their world scrubbed clean with chants and bull's urine. But now, let us turn to something softer, cooler, yet no less sacred. Water, flowing, shimmering, whispering through their empire like a living artery. To most of us, water is refreshment, utility, a backdrop. But in ancient Persia, water was a goddess, not a metaphorical one, a real, breathing, divine presence, named Aradvi Sura Anahita, goddess of the sacred river and mother of all waters. The Persians didn't just drink from rivers. They revered them, protected them, legislated them. To foul a stream was not a minor offence, it was a cosmic crime. If the sacred fire was the soul of the empire, then water was its heartbeat. And just as the fire was to be shielded from breath and dust, water was to be guarded from filth, death, and even thoughtless touch. You could quench your thirst, yes, but only if you did so without arrogance. Only if you remembered that the water beneath your feet might be the tears of a goddess. Picture a dusty Persian village. The sun is heavy overhead, and you walk toward the edge of a stream, a clear blue ribbon threading its way through the land. You see men leading their goats to the water's edge, but stopping short, letting the animals drink while their hooves stay dry. You see women rinsing clothes, always downstream, never upstream, never facing the source directly. They do not soak, they do not splash, because recklessness near water is not carelessness, it is impiety. And the laws? Brutal in their precision. Urinating near a stream could earn you 50 lashes. Washing a corpse near a well could bring more. If an animal died in the water, especially a dog, the sacred guardian of Zoroastrian law, the area became a site of ritual emergency. The people could not simply move on. The priests were called. They arrived with gomez, ashes, firewood and verses. The body was removed, not with hands, but with tools. And then came the days of purification, circling, chanting, waiting. Only when the priests declared the goddess satisfied could the water be used again. Because it wasn't just water. It was Apa, a living divine force. Every stream, well and canal was a thread of her body, and to violate it was to wound her. She gave life to crops, animals, wombs. She was the mother of nourishment and the vessel of balance, and like all mothers, she demanded respect. This reverence seeped into engineering. The Persians didn't simply build canals for utility. They built them with alignment, with purpose. The underground water channels, qanats, dug with almost superhuman foresight, weren't just marvels of hydraulic ingenuity. They were sacred arteries, built in harmony with the earth, the sun, and the spirit of water itself. A misaligned well wasn't just inefficient, it was sinful. And even when water was plentiful, it wasn't free. You couldn't hoard it, you couldn't block it. Landowners who diverted flow unjustly faced steep penalties, not just from courts, but from communities who believed their actions risked divine wrath. If your selfish irrigation poisoned a stream and a neighbour's field went dry, it wasn't just property loss, it was sacrilege. You had insulted the goddess. You had opened a breach in the covenant of fertility. The records of these laws survive, not just in myth, but in administrative documents. Fines, lashes, banishments, penalties tied directly to misuse of water. And always, always the emphasis on purity. Not just physical, but spiritual. Water touched everything: food, bodies, crops, prayer. If it was impure, everything it touched became impure. A polluted stream could ripple into social collapse. The fear wasn't about hygiene, it was about cosmology. Even during death rituals, when the rest of the world might use water for washing the body, Persians refused. The body was too corrupt, water too holy. The two could not meet. To wash death with life was unthinkable. Instead, death was kept far from water, and water was guarded like a relic. Children were raised with these beliefs. They were taught to step lightly around springs, to never throw rocks into ponds, to never spit near a canal, not because it was rude, but because the water was watching, and she remembered. And the priests, always the custodians, played a critical role. They didn't just chant over fire, they whispered over rivers too. They determined when water was clean, when it was safe, when it had been insulted and needed atonement. A man might go to the temple to confess that he had drunk from an unclean stream, not for his health, but for his soul. He might be assigned prayers, fasts, rituals of purification. He might be told to bring offerings to the river flowers, spices, firewood, a kind of apology to a being without a face, but with a memory older than stone. And yet, despite the strictness, water was celebrated, honoured. There were festivals for Anahita, songs, dances, offerings left at the banks of rivers, prayers of gratitude for rain. Women in particular revered her patroness of fertility and strength. To conceive, to give birth, to nurture, these were seen as gifts drawn directly from the sacred waters of the world. And so Persia flowed, both spiritually and literally, through these divine channels. It is no coincidence that the empire thrived where others withered. Their water laws weren't just about cleanliness, they were about survival, cooperation, reverence, the understanding that life could not be owned, only borrowed. Compare that to today, where rivers are dammed and forgotten, where waste chokes sacred flow, where water is seen as product instead of presence. And suddenly Persia's obsession doesn't feel so strange. It feels prophetic. The Persians weren't wrong to fear the consequences of disrespect. They were only early. You've walked with the Persians through fire. You've watched their justice burn into flesh, their dead carried to the sky, their world scrubbed clean with chants and bull's urine. But now, let us turn to something softer, cooler, yet no less sacred. Water, flowing, shimmering, whispering through their empire like a living artery. To most of us, water is refreshment, utility, a backdrop. But in ancient Persia, water was a goddess, not a metaphorical one, a real, breathing, divine presence named Aredvi Sura Anahita, goddess of the sacred river and mother of all waters. The Persians didn't just drink from rivers. They revered them, protected them, legislated them. To foul a stream was not a minor offence, it was a cosmic crime. If the sacred fire was the soul of the empire, then water was its heartbeat. And just as the fire was to be shielded from breath and dust, water was to be guarded from filth, death, and even thoughtless touch. You could quench your thirst, yes, but only if you did so without arrogance. Only if you remembered that the water beneath your feet might be the tears of a goddess. Picture a dusty Persian village. The sun is heavy overhead, and you walk toward the edge of a stream, a clear blue ribbon threading its way through the land. You see men leading their goats to the water's edge, but stopping short, letting the animals drink while their hooves stay dry. You see women rinsing clothes, always downstream, never upstream, never facing the source directly. They do not soak, they do not splash, because recklessness near water is not carelessness, it is impiety. And the laws? Brutal in their precision. Urinating near a stream could earn you 50 lashes. Washing a corpse near a well could bring more. If an animal died in the water, especially a dog, the sacred guardian of Zoroastrian law, the area became a site of ritual emergency. The people could not simply move on. The priests were called. They arrived with gomez, ashes, firewood, and verses. The body was removed, not with hands, but with tools. And then came the days of purification, circling, chanting, waiting. Only when the priests declared the goddess satisfied could the water be used again, because it wasn't just water. It was upper, a living divine force. Every stream, well, and canal was a thread of her body, and to violate it was to wound her. She gave life to crops, animals, wombs. She was the mother of nourishment and the vessel of balance. And like all mothers, she demanded respect. This reverence seeped into engineering. The Persians didn't simply build canals for utility. They built them with alignment, with purpose. The underground water channels, qanats, dug with almost superhuman foresight, weren't just marvels of hydraulic ingenuity. They were sacred arteries, built in harmony with the earth, the sun, and the spirit of water itself. A misaligned well wasn't just inefficient, it was sinful. And even when water was plentiful, it wasn't free. You couldn't hoard it, you couldn't block it. Landowners who diverted flow unjustly faced steep penalties, not just from courts, but from communities who believed their actions risked divine wrath. If your selfish irrigation poisoned a stream and a neighbour's field went dry, it wasn't just property loss, it was sacrilege. You had insulted the goddess. You had opened a breach in the covenant of fertility. The records of these laws survive, not just in myth, but in administrative documents. Fines, lashes, banishments, penalties tied directly to misuse of water. And always, always the emphasis on purity. Not just physical, but spiritual. Water touched everything: food, bodies, crops, prayer. If it was impure, everything it touched became impure. A polluted stream could ripple into social collapse. The fear wasn't about hygiene, it was about cosmology. Even during death rituals, when the rest of the world might use water for washing the body, Persians refused. The body was too corrupt, water too holy. The two could not meet. To wash death with life was unthinkable. Instead, death was kept far from water, and water was guarded like a relic. Children were raised with these beliefs. They were taught to step lightly around springs, to never throw rocks into ponds, to never spit near a canal, not because it was rude, but because the water was watching, and she remembered. And the priests, always the custodians, played a critical role. They didn't just chant over fire, they whispered over rivers too. They determined when water was clean, when it was safe, when it had been insulted and needed atonement. A man might go to the temple to confess that he had drunk from an unclean stream, not for his health, but for his soul. He might be assigned prayers, fasts, rituals of purification. He might be told to bring offerings to the river flowers, spices, firewood. A kind of apology to a being without a face, but with a memory older than stone. And yet, despite the strictness, water was celebrated, honoured. There were festivals for Anahita, songs, dances, offerings left at the banks of rivers, prayers of gratitude for rain. Women in particular revered her patroness of fertility and strength, to conceive, to give birth, to nurture. These were seen as gifts drawn directly from the sacred waters of the world, and so Persia flowed, both spiritually and literally, through these divine channels. It is no coincidence that the empire thrived where others withered. Their water laws weren't just about cleanliness, they were about survival, cooperation, reverence, the understanding that life could not be owned, only borrowed. Compare that to today, where rivers are dammed and forgotten, where waste chokes sacred flow, where water is seen as product instead of presence, and suddenly Persia's obsession doesn't feel so strange. It feels prophetic. The Persians weren't wrong to fear the consequences of disrespect. They were only early. In their belief, when water is defiled, life unravels. And maybe they were right. Chapter 8. The Gender Paradox. Women in power, women in chains. In most retellings of ancient history, women are often relegated to the margins, shadows behind thrones, whispers in palaces, or the occasional tragic figure immortalized in myth. But Persia, in its complex glory, refused to stay within such simple narratives. The ancient Persian woman was both respected and restricted, both powerful and invisible, depending entirely on her class, her faith, and the shifting currents of royal decree. If you lived in ancient Persia, the experience of womanhood could be one of astonishing freedom or suffocating confinement, and sometimes both in the very same breath. Let us begin at the top. The royal court, the shining marble floors of Persepolis and Susa, where the great kings of the Achaemenid Empire ruled with god-like authority. Here, women of the nobility wielded real power, often managing vast estates, commanding personal armies, and even issuing economic decrees sealed with their own royal insignias. Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, wife of Darius I, and mother of Xerxes, was not merely a queen, she was a force of governance. Her name appears in administrative records as a landowner, a patron of temples, and a political advisor. She may well have shaped succession politics behind the veil of protocol, bending the ear of the most powerful men in Asia. Persian women of noble birth were not cloistered in the way many of their Greek or Roman counterparts were. They travelled, often with protection, and attended royal ceremonies. Some were educated in languages, mathematics, and even astronomy. The court had scribes and tutors for elite girls, just as it did for boys. They were also deeply involved in religious life, particularly in the worship of Anahita, the goddess of fertility, water, and war. In temples dedicated to her, priestesses held rituals, offered prayers, and participated in public life as spiritual authorities. But this was not the whole story. Beneath the silk-draped elegance of the court lay a very different Persian woman, one born not into privilege, but into labour. For the women of the common classes, especially in rural provinces or conquered territories, life was an unending rhythm of toil. Agricultural records from Persepolis show that women made up a significant percentage of the empire's labour force, particularly in textile production, grain storage, and temple maintenance. These women worked hard, often under overseers, sometimes receiving rations of barley, wine, and clothing instead of money. And yet even these working women were not entirely powerless. In some cases, they earned wages, signed contracts, and had the right to own property. A Babylonian tablet from the Achaemenid era shows a woman named Iltani leasing a parcel of farmland and negotiating terms independently, a rare autonomy in a world ruled by male lineages. So while gender inequality certainly existed, it operated within a surprisingly nuanced legal framework. Marriage, however, was a different matter. For many Persian women, marriage was less a partnership than a transaction arranged, recorded, and enforced by the family and local clergy. A girl could be promised by her father before she even reached puberty, and once wed, her body, her children, and often her property were considered extensions of the husband's lineage. Divorce was technically allowed, but heavily stigmatized. A woman who left her husband without approval faced social ruin, and her children could be taken from her under patriarchal inheritance laws. Yet even here, contradiction reigned. Some Persian legal codes granted women rights of inheritance, especially if they were widowed or childless. Widows could manage estates, initiate legal proceedings, and even act as guardians for younger relatives. In fact, the Avestan texts suggest that widows were often entrusted with sacred duties, believed to be especially close to the divine due to their suffering and resilience. And while public modesty was expected, the seclusion of women was not universal. The idea of the harem, so often romanticized or demonized in modern retellings, was real, but it was more an administrative center than a prison. Yes, the king's wives and concubines were separated from the public, but within the harem, women managed finances, oversaw rituals, trained servants, and sometimes functioned as spies or informants for the court. The notion that these women were idle and powerless is not only incorrect, it erases the subtle channels of influence they cultivated. Then there were the taboos, deep, ancient beliefs rooted in Zoroastrian cosmology. A menstruating woman, for instance, was considered ritually impure. During her cycle, she was not to cook, touch sacred objects, or participate in prayer. Some texts even recommend she be isolated in a separate room, away from fire, water, and the earth. This wasn't about hygiene, it was spiritual quarantine. To violate it was to risk infecting the world with chaos, with nasu, with the force of rot and disorder. And childbirth, equally feared and revered. A woman in labour was both a vessel of divine creation and a potential contaminant. The delivery room had to be prepared with chants, fire, and ritual boundaries. If the birth was difficult or the child stillborn, the mother might undergo elaborate cleansing rites before being allowed to return to communal spaces. But if she bore a healthy son, she was celebrated. If she bore several, her status could rise within the household. She might even gain influence in family decisions or temple offerings. It's tempting to call this contradiction, but the ancient Persians didn't see it that way. To them, a woman could be sacred and dangerous, wise and subordinate, exalted and quarantined without conflict. Gender was not a line, but a circle of roles, each with its own time and function. One could be a priestess and a mother, a property owner and a spiritual contaminant, a royal advisor and a silenced widow. And somehow the society absorbed these paradoxes into a functioning empire that stretched from Libya to the Indus. The deeper truth is this. Ancient Persian society did not fear complexity, it thrived in it. Where we seek binaries, freedom or oppression, power or submission, they saw a web of sacred duties, legal permissions, and social expectations that shifted like desert sand under royal decree and divine law. But would a modern observer be horrified? Certainly. The idea that a woman could be locked in a purification room for her natural cycle, that her voice could be legally silenced in court without a male witness, that her marriage could be signed before she could read. And yet, the same society that enforced those rules also gave birth to astronomer queens, property-owning widows, and high priestesses who spoke in thunderous rituals before roaring fires. It's not a contradiction. It's a tension, sacred, strange, and very Persian. Now that we've glimpsed the structural landscape of womanhood in ancient Persia, the temples, the laws, the paradoxes, it's time to step closer. To look at real women, or at least as real as the fragmented remnants of clay tablets, inscriptions, and oral tradition allow. Let's begin not in the palace halls, but in the bureaucratic heart of the Achaemenid Empire, Persepolis. Here, deep within the administrative archives carved into Elamite tablets, lie stories that challenge every modern assumption about ancient gender dynamics. Among those aged records, scholars found something remarkable: lists of rations distributed to female workers, not just in token gestures, but in detailed breakdowns by rank, skill, and even pregnancy status. Women were categorized as apprentice, senior worker, or overseer, and each role came with precise compensation measured in wine, barley, and sometimes silver. One woman, whose name survives only partially, Arta, was documented as supervising dozens of laborers across regions. She received rations equal to or exceeding those of male counterparts. Was she noble, literate, a widow turned businesswoman? We don't know. But what is certain is that she existed, and she ran things. This flips our assumptions. Ancient societies, especially empires, are often imagined as patriarchal pyramids where men built, led, and commanded while women served in silence. Yet here is a record, untouched for millennia, whispering a different story. Arta wasn't an exception. The tablets mention many like her women managing textile production, overseeing animal herding operations, even commanding male subordinates. It wasn't equality by modern standards, but it was structured authority, institutionalized, recognized. But this glimpse into agency doesn't cancel out the shadows. Even the highest-ranking women had to navigate landmines of cultural taboo. Take Parysatis, wife of Darius II and mother of Artaxerxes II. She was infamous, feared, and immensely influential. Ancient Greek writers like Plutarch and Ctesias painted her as ruthless, poisoning rivals, manipulating court politics, ordering executions with a whisper. But these descriptions, though clearly flavored by cultural bias, also reveal that she was not bound by traditional gender passivity. She played the political game, viciously, unapologetically, and very effectively. Still, her notoriety came at a cost. Male historians depicted her as a monster, a cautionary tale of what happens when women acquire too much power. This isn't unfamiliar. Powerful women throughout history have often been mythologized as witches, seductresses, or tyrants. In Persia too, gender norms cracked under the weight of ambition, but the backlash could be brutal. Outside the elite, however, it was often religion, not politics, that defined a woman's worth. The Zoroastrian reverence for purity extended into private life in ways that shaped every ritual, meal, and gesture. A wife was expected to pray regularly, maintain ritual cleanliness, and avoid contaminating sacred elements during her monthly cycle. But she also served as the spiritual heart of the home, ensuring that fire altars were tended and children were taught moral tenets from the Avesta. Yet even in these deeply structured roles, ancient Persian society revealed curious cracks. A rare Avestan hymn speaks of the woman who speaks truth before the fire, suggesting that female oracles or ritual leaders may have existed. Another fragment references a girl who binds the holy belt in a rite normally reserved for male priests. Were these anomalies, experimental reforms, lost traditions? Whatever they were, they suggest that even in religious life, fluidity sometimes overrode rigidity, and then there was love, or something like it. Romantic relationships in ancient Persia were rarely about romance, at least not as a priority. Marriages were arranged often between cousins and solidified family alliances or property lines. Polygamy was legal, though not especially common outside the royal family. A nobleman might take multiple wives for diplomatic reasons, but managing such households came with enormous social and financial complexity. However, poetry from later Achaemenid and early Parthian eras gives tantalizing hints that passion still found a way. Fragments speak of longing glances during festivals, of lovers who exchanged tokens in secret, of wives who mourned their husbands with verses too delicate for state scribes to record. These private expressions weren't central to Persian politics or law, but they prove that human desire persisted beneath the heavy robes of duty and honor. Still, nothing reveals the Persian gender paradox more starkly than their approach to punishment and justice. A woman accused of adultery could be executed or spared depending on her husband's status and the priest's interpretation. But a man who seduced another's wife might be forced to pay damages, lashings, or public humiliation. In some cases, if the woman was considered complicit, the penalty was shared. Yet once again, the texts betray a strange flexibility. In certain provinces, particularly in Elamite-influenced regions, women could sue for wrongful accusations, reclaim dowries, and petition for divorce rights far ahead of their time and place. By the Sasanian era, centuries later, many of these complexities had narrowed. Women's rights were increasingly codified, but also more limited. The influence of stricter priestly interpretations, possibly influenced by regional conservatism and growing Christian competition, led to the gradual erosion of female autonomy. What had once been a web of contradictions slowly hardened into something more predictably patriarchal. But during the empire's prime, Persian society lived in the space between opposites. Women were both agents and subjects, icons and vessels, guardians of the sacred and pollutants of the same. They were not equal, but neither were they invisible. They were seen, recorded, respected, feared, and sometimes, just sometimes, heard. Today, much of this would be deeply uncomfortable to witness. A menstruating girl isolated for days, a wife forbidden from lighting her own hearth, a young bride promised to a cousin she barely knows. And yet, beside that discomfort, you'd also see a noblewoman overseeing royal estates, a widow defending her land in court, a mother reciting holy words before the flame. It's a world that challenges modern binaries. Not progressive, not regressive, just Persian. Alive with contradiction, soaked in ritual, and governed by a cosmic order that left no room for simplicity. As we close this chapter, it's worth reflecting not only on how far we've come, but on how layered, tangled, and deeply human history truly is. The Persian woman was not just a figure in the background of empire. She was its breath, its silence, its defiance, and its wound. Chapter 9. The Clean and the Cursed. Persia's invisible laws of purity. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine living in a world where your every breath, gesture, bodily function, even your thoughts, could potentially offend the gods, upset the balance of the cosmos, and doom your soul. Not because you sinned, not because you broke a law, but because you simply existed. In ancient Persia, that wasn't spiritual paranoia. That was daily life. This was a world obsessed with the unseen. The Persian worldview, shaped by the profound teachings of Zoroastrianism, was built on a grand cosmic battlefield between truth and lie, purity and defilement, light and shadow. And unlike modern religions, where sin is often about morality, in Zoroastrian Persia, sin was often physical. It had weight, odor, texture, and could literally cling to you like rot. You couldn't always see it, but it saw you. This belief was so deeply embedded that it shaped every aspect of personal hygiene, food preparation, childbirth, death rituals, farming, even architecture. A drop of blood. These weren't just biological events. They were spiritual landmines. Let's begin with death. In most cultures, death is solemn, sad, occasionally beautiful. In ancient Persia, it was catastrophic. The moment a person died, their body became the carrier of Nasu, the demon of putrefaction. This invisible, malevolent force didn't just inhabit the corpse, it radiated from it, infecting the air, the earth, even the water if touched. You couldn't bury a corpse. That would contaminate the sacred earth. You couldn't burn it. That would violate the sacred fire. You couldn't throw it in water. That would pollute the divine element. They built towers of silence, circular stone platforms high and isolated, where corpses were placed and left to be consumed by vultures under the open sky. It wasn't cruelty, it was cosmic respect. Flesh had to be returned to the animal world without tainting the elements. Once the bones were cleaned, they could be placed in ossuaries, their spiritual residue purified through ritual and time. This death ritual was not optional. If someone died inside a home, the building was considered cursed unless intense cleansing rituals were performed, sometimes involving bull's urine, chants, and isolation of the space for months. People who handled the dead were not shunned, but were considered ritually impure, requiring multiple baths, fasts, and spiritual supervision to re-enter society. It wasn't superstition, it was order. It was keeping the world clean. But death wasn't the only trigger. Blood too was feared, not in battle, but in biology. Menstruating women, as mentioned in earlier chapters, were considered ritually impure. During their cycle, they were often confined to specific rooms or cottages, prohibited from touching sacred flames, food, or animals. They couldn't prepare meals or draw water. They weren't even supposed to speak sacred words. This wasn't about shame. It was about fear cosmic infection. Even nosebleeds, injuries, childbirth, or dreams involving blood could require purification. Purification rituals were complex and sometimes took days. Sacred prayers, fire invocations, and repeated washings with water or urine were prescribed. Yes, urine specifically from healthy sacred bulls was considered one of the most potent cleansing substances in ancient Persia. It was used to wash hands, feet, utensils, and in extreme cases even the tongue. If someone had spoken words of the Drowsy, the lie, to speak falsely, to even accidentally utter the wrong blessing, was to stain your soul. Words had weight, and Zoroastrian priests believed that lies produced a physical stench in the mouth that only ritual could erase. Some purification manuals even listed breath and speech among the most volatile substances in the cosmos. Water was sacred and fiercely protected. The Persian Empire created elaborate khanats, underground aqueducts, to preserve and channel clean water without exposing it to sunlight or contamination. Public bathing was rare, not because people were unclean, but because sharing water meant risking spiritual contagion. Water was a living force, connected directly to the deity Anahita, and it was criminal, literally criminal, to spit or bleed in a river. Such acts could carry fines, exile, or public punishment. Animals, too, were part of the purity equation. Dogs, especially certain breeds, were considered spiritually significant. To harm a dog, even accidentally, was a grievous offence. But rats, snakes, ants, and insects associated with decay were considered agents of the Drowsy and could be killed on sight. This moral ecosystem of creatures was unique. There were holy animals, cursed animals, and rules about each. Killing the wrong one, or in the wrong way, required a priest, a ritual, and often a sacrifice of time or goods to cleanse the act. Even your home wasn't exempt, the hearth was sacred. A fire in a Persian home wasn't just for warmth, it was the tongue of Ahura Mazda, the great creator. You didn't cook in silence. You recited blessings, you didn't let the fire go out, it was fed, watched, spoken to. If a visitor entered your house, they were judged not only by manners, but by whether they approached the hearth with proper reverence. To let your fire die was a spiritual offence. To let a woman on her period cook near it could undo blessings on your entire household. And all of this intense spiritual cleanliness, was tracked. Rituals were performed at specific times of day. Family heads kept scrolls, or at the very least oral records, of ritual obligations. Some noble houses had dedicated priests or purity keepers who ensured every act, from childbirth to the slaughter of a chicken, followed divine order. Children were taught early to recognize signs of spiritual contamination, to avoid those who carried it, and to confess immediately if they had touched, seen, or smelled something impure. The truly unsettling part. They believed this vigilance was love for the gods, love for creation, a sacred responsibility not only to keep oneself clean, but to guard the cosmic balance from tipping into chaos. In their view, you were not just living, you were helping the world survive. To us, this might feel oppressive, exhausting, even suffocating. Imagine having to account for every step, sneeze, dream or mistake, not to a god of forgiveness, but to a cosmic ledger of order, relentlessly watched by unseen forces that demanded perfection in thought, word and action. But for ancient Persians, this was harmony. Life was not random. It was written, monitored, shaped by unseen laws that governed stars and skin alike. To live in alignment was to live beautifully. To live carelessly was to invite rot, quite literally. And so they built fire temples, chanted prayers at dawn, and washed away the smell of lies with sacred liquid, all in the belief that purity wasn't about control. It was about survival, in a world where even your dreams had consequences. In the cool shadows of a Persian dawn, before the sun kissed the mountaintops, and before even the market stalls creaked open, a silent process had already begun. The Pavi, a ritual space laid with sanctified earth and swept clean with holy intent, waited quietly. Not for an emperor, not for a festival, but for a man or sometimes a woman who had done something that no one around them could see, and yet everyone understood. They had become ritually polluted. Maybe they had buried a relative. Maybe they had stepped too close to a corpse. Maybe they had unknowingly spoken near a woman considered impure by the calendar of her cycle. It didn't matter how it happened. What mattered was the cleansing, and ancient Persia made no compromises in such matters. The priests of Zoroaster had not merely inherited spiritual traditions. They had codified cosmic hygiene. Their texts were filled with charts, procedures, sequences of chants, and minute distinctions between types of impurity, how long each lasted, what it affected, and how to remove it. And while much of the world was fumbling with fire and instinct, Persia was erecting a universe in which purity was law, and that law was enforced not with swords, but with sand, water, fire, and obsession. Take, for instance, the design of cities. These were not chaotic clusters of homes and temples. Persian urban planning reflected spiritual geography. Waterways were carefully routed to avoid passing too close to cemeteries. The homes of priests and ritual specialists were often positioned at elevated or central locations, symbolic of their role in maintaining spiritual alignment. Fire temples were built with rigorous architectural guidelines, aligned with the stars, shielded from winds that might blow impure dust into the sacred flame, and located far from slaughterhouses or sites of illness. Public buildings had zones of ritual access. Not everyone could walk through the same doorway. If you were menstruating, if you had recently been to a funeral, or even if you'd had an unclean dream, as judged by certain omens or feelings upon waking, you were expected to enter through specific areas or not at all. This wasn't merely cultural, it was priest-supervised law. You've just travelled 3 days across desert terrain with camel loads of silk and saffron. You're covered in dust, sweat, and you've perhaps slept beside a dying animal the night before. You arrive at a town and are immediately stopped, not by a customs official, but by a temple guardian. You are not allowed to enter until you undergo ritual washing, recitation of prescribed verses, and in some cases, the sprinkling of consecrated urine. Not for disinfection, but for spiritual sterilization. Did it slow trade? Of course. But to the Persians, it protected more than economy. It protected the cosmic balance between Asher, Truth Thorda, and Druzhli, Achaos. The very bricks of their world were believed to be aligned with these forces. Disease, too, was not purely biological. Illness was seen as the physical manifestation of spiritual imbalance. A boil or infection was not just a concern for your physician. It was evidence that you, or someone close to you, had violated purity codes. Perhaps your household fire had not been fed properly. Perhaps a menstruating woman had passed too close to a sanctified well. Perhaps a corpse had been buried improperly a mile away. The priests would be consulted, and a ritual diagnosis would be made. These rituals were exhaustive. The Barishnom, one of the most intense purification ceremonies in Zoroastrian practice, involved 9 nights of isolation, precise washing in consecrated locations, recitation of chants, and strict diets. The person undergoing this wasn't a criminal. They might simply have touched the wrong object at the wrong time, but they had to atone, to rebalance their body and soul with the cosmic rhythms. The priests who conducted these rituals were known not just for piety, but for terrifying memory. They remembered lineages, violations, transgressions that happened decades earlier. They carried scrolls and oral histories of families who had strayed from the code's cases where a man's land had been stricken with drought after ignoring a purification rite. Entire neighborhoods could be spiritually blacklisted. It sounds extreme, but in a society where the spiritual world and material world were intertwined completely, such blacklisting could result in loss of trade, reputation, or even marriage prospects. Speaking of marriage, the purity obsession didn't end at the temple gates. It seeped into relationships. Bloodlines were carefully tracked, not just for heritage, but for ritual eligibility. A family with too many recent dead or too many known transgressions could be considered ritually unstable. Priests would examine astrological signs, community gossip, and previous rituals performed before endorsing a union. In some cases, families were required to undergo pre-marriage purification ceremonies, ensuring their spiritual cleanliness matched their social compatibility, and children were indoctrinated early. Rituals like the Navyote, the Zoroastrian initiation ceremony, were not merely symbolic. They were formal admissions into the purity economy. From that moment on, the child was expected to wear the sacred shirt and girdle, to recite daily prayers, and to avoid impurity with almost paranoid precision. Accidents were forgiven. Ignorance was not. Over time, as Persian empires encountered other cultures, Greek, Indian, Mesopotamian, there were shifts, interactions, contaminations even. But the Zoroastrian framework held firm, influencing everything from law to architecture, from diplomacy to daily meals. It shaped how Persians saw themselves, their enemies, and even their gods. To be Persian, in the eyes of the devout, wasn't just to speak a language or serve a king. It was to protect the purity of the world, to be a soldier in a quiet war against filth, not physical, but cosmic. And perhaps most astonishingly, this system worked. It created stability, predictability, a spiritual architecture so dense and interwoven that for centuries Persia stood as one of the most advanced, orderly, and culturally rich civilizations in the ancient world. But behind that elegance, those magnificent palaces, brilliant engineers, golden armies, was a shadowy lattice of fear, fire, and obsessive cleanliness that governed every breath. And as we walk away from this chapter, let us ask, what unseen laws govern us today? What rituals do we perform, not knowing why? And what silent architects are still shaping our world, not with iron or law, but with ideas so old, we've forgotten their ideas at all? Chapter 10. The Empire That Watched Itself. Spies, scandals, and the ancient Persian. Long before modern governments filled the skies with satellites and the streets with security cameras, ancient Persia had already mastered the delicate and dangerous art of watching its own people. But it wasn't just about catching rebels or thieves. In the eyes of the Persian kings, surveillance was morality. It was cosmic duty. It was how you kept chaos from seeping in through the cracks of empire. And it was how a civilization that spanned continents, climates, and creeds managed to maintain an eerily stable grasp over its citizens for centuries. The Persian Empire, especially under the Achaemenids, was vast. From the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the rugged highlands of Bactria, from Egyptian sands to the edges of the Greek world, it stretched like a golden net pulled across the ancient world. But an empire that big couldn't survive on force alone. It needed eyes everywhere, eyes that didn't blink, eyes that didn't sleep. Enter the king's eyes and ears. That was the name given to a secretive network of inspectors, informants, and internal agents who operated not as soldiers or governors, but as shadow witnesses to the daily workings of the empire. These agents were empowered directly by the king, often bypassing local satraps or officials, to observe, report, and, when necessary, intervene. Now imagine you're a governor in a distant Persian province. You're wealthy, powerful, perhaps even born of noble blood. But at any moment, a man could arrive at your court, not dressed as a soldier, not flanked by guards, but calm, courteous, carrying scrolls with the seal of the great king himself. He asks questions. He watches your ceremonies, He takes notes as you eat, as you speak, as your servants bow. He might even befriend your wife or your priest. And then he disappears. Months later, you receive a message. The king knows you've been overtaxing farmers. He knows your son is cavorting with rebels. He knows you've skimped on tributes, or worse, mocked his laws in private. You're summoned back to Persepolis. Your household is dismantled. Your property seized. Sometimes you're spared. Sometimes you're executed. All because someone watched and someone reported. This wasn't rumour. Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled much of Persian life, often spoke in awe and fear of the king's agents. He described them as a pervasive intelligence system, so thorough that even local leaders felt powerless in their presence. To the Greeks it seemed oppressive. To the Persians it was divine oversight. The king, after all, was not just a ruler. He was the earthly vessel of order, chosen by the gods to maintain Asha truth, justice, and balance. Even among the military, this surveillance was ever present. Generals were watched not only for their victories, but for signs of pride or deviation. Soldiers were rewarded for reporting misconduct, not just disobedience in the field, but impurity in personal life. Was an officer sleeping with a priestess outside the rules? Did a commander eat unclean food before battle? Did a noble fail to light the family fire for too many days? All could be noted, sent back, and judged. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Persian surveillance wasn't just its breadth, it was its subtlety. Many spies didn't even look like spies. They were merchants, pilgrims, entertainers. A trader from Susa might arrive in Babylon and strike up conversation about grain prices, only to send coded updates back to the court about regional unrest. A singer at a noble banquet might record which guests made off-colour jokes about the king, and in temples, priests loyal to the king would quietly inform him of any religious deviance which was seen as a precursor to rebellion. This was no accidental system, it was architected. Persia's roads, the finest in the ancient world, didn't just move goods and armies, they moved information. The Royal Road, stretching over 2,500 kilometres, had rest stops every 25 miles where messages could be handed off like batons in a relay race. A single report could travel from the Aegean Sea to Susa in mere days. For the ancient world, this was lightning speed. And the messengers? They were trusted beyond even the king's generals. They carried wax-sealed tablets with encrypted messages, and they were sworn to deliver them without delay, without pause, even if it cost their lives. The punishment for interfering with one? Death. But surveillance wasn't just for catching the guilty, it was for testing the loyal. Loyalty in Persia wasn't assumed, it was tested. Periodically the king would send false information down the ranks. Rumours of invasion, mock edicts, fabricated betrayals, just to see who reacted. A satrap who began preparing for war without proper orders might be declared disloyal. A noble who hesitated to obey a sudden new law might be marked for further observation. It was a game of trust and traps, and only the most disciplined survived. This system, however, came at a cost. Fear spread through every layer of Persian society. The line between loyalty and paranoia thinned. Families became cautious of each other. Servants whispered into walls. And while many citizens believed in the divine justice of the king, others began to wonder who truly ruled them, the king or his unseen eyes. Some resisted. Small rebellions flared up from time to time, often led by charismatic leaders who claimed the king had become too distant, too cruel. But these uprisings rarely lasted. They were often crushed not by armies, but by information leaks, exposed from within before a sword was ever drawn. Even within the palace itself, the king trusted few. His food tasters were rotated weekly. His guards were trained not just in defence, but in loyalty conditioning. His wives and concubines were often selected from noble families, not just for beauty, but as political insurance. Their loyalty meant their family's survival. Yet, for all this control, Persian civilization thrived. Arts blossomed, cities flourished, laws stabilized, and the people for the most part lived in a world of order. A world where chaos was kept at bay, not just by strength, but by vigilance. In the end, the Persian surveillance state wasn't about catching criminals, it was about sustaining a myth that the king, chosen by the divine, was everywhere. That he knew your truth before you spoke it. that the world was, even in its silence, always being observed. And isn't that, in some way, more powerful than any army? The myth of the all-seeing king was powerful. It extended far beyond palace walls and courtrooms. It was something whispered in childhood, reinforced at marketplaces, echoed from the mouths of priests, and carved into the very architecture of empire. You see, the Persians didn't just rely on human informants, they ritualized observation, they made it sacred. And in doing so, they created a culture where being watched wasn't just feared, it was expected. Temples, for instance, became natural nodes in the intelligence network. Priests weren't only spiritual guides, they were moral auditors, trackers of ritual purity, and unofficial guardians of loyalty. If a man skipped ceremonial duties, if he delayed his pilgrimage, if he asked too many questions about doctrine, it wasn't just seen as negligence, it was noted. Because religious deviation, in Zoroastrian ideology, was often the first sign of Drowsy, the cosmic lie, a force that could unravel civilization itself, and where Drowsy was suspected, royal attention followed. Even at funerals, rituals were observed with scrutiny. The rites for the dead had to be performed precisely, not just for spiritual peace, but to demonstrate one's understanding of cosmic order. A family that buried its dead improperly could be reported. A household that failed to keep its sacred fire lit could be considered lax and therefore disloyal. And let's not forget, in Zoroastrianism, fire wasn't just a symbol of light. It was the medium through which truth burned. Let it die, and you invited suspicion. Inside homes, especially those of minor nobles or wealthy merchants, paranoia became habit. Families began building inner rooms without windows, not for modesty but privacy. It wasn't that they feared spies were constantly watching, it was that they feared they might be. That constant maybe reshaped daily behavior. Parents began teaching their children to speak carefully, to show deference even when angry, to appear virtuous even when unseen. Because in Persia, the performance of loyalty wasn't just for public show, it had to be performed everywhere, always. Marriage, too, became entangled in the surveillance mindset. Alliances were no longer just between lovers or families. They became tools of political security. A governor might marry his daughter to the son of a rival noble, not for affection, but to ensure eyes inside the rival's house. These weren't just marriages, they were wiretaps with wedding rings. The woman, often well-educated and loyal to her bloodline, was expected to observe, to listen, and to quietly report anything unseemly. Her loyalty wasn't to her husband, it was to her father, her clan, or in some cases the king. And then came the court poets. These weren't simple verse-makers penning odes to the moon. Persian poets, especially those in royal or noble circles, often wielded sharp pens soaked in flattery and subtle threat. Through allegory and metaphor, they praised the king's all-knowing wisdom, while warning others of the cost of betrayal. A single line, in flowery symbolism, could ruin a career or trigger an inquiry. Poetry became surveillance disguised as song, entertainment laced with espionage. But for all this order and loyalty, there was a boiling point, because paranoia doesn't just monitor enemies, it creates them. The later years of the Achaemenid dynasty began to show cracks not in its military power, but in its social trust. Nobles began turning on each other. Accusations of heresy, treason, and secret rebellion became more common. Some were real, many were invented. A whispered rumor could destroy a legacy overnight. A falsified report could lead to arrest, even if there was no crime. Loyalty itself became a gamble, a performance so rehearsed that sincerity faded from public life. By the time Alexander the Great began his campaign into Persian lands, the empire was still vast, but increasingly fragile. Not because its armies were weak, they were still formidable. Not because its wealth had vanished. Persian treasuries overflowed, but because its internal surveillance culture had eroded its own trust. Satraps distrusted their messengers. Nobles refused to dine with one another. Royal heirs plotted not out of greed, but self-preservation. They all knew the system too well. The sword wasn't the most dangerous weapon anymore. It was the scroll, the whisper, the misread glance that suggested your loyalty was questionable. And then there was the people. Ordinary citizens had learned to live in watchfulness. Many adapted. They played the part, lit the fires, kissed the seals, kept their heads down. But others began to withdraw. Civic life lost its spontaneity. Public spaces became colder. Joy, that fragile spark of unscripted life, became something you only shared behind closed doors, if at all. The streets of once vibrant cities like Susa and Ecbatana still bustled with trade, but laughter became quieter, festivals more controlled, and gossip more dangerous. In the end, when Alexander's forces marched into Persia and began dismantling the great palaces, they didn't just conquer cities. They released a pressure valve. Many Persians welcomed them, not because they hated their king, but because they were exhausted, tired of watching their backs, tired of scripting every sentence, tired of proving their innocence in a world that presumed guilt. Still, the surveillance state left its mark. For centuries after, even under foreign rule, Persians remembered the network of eyes and ears, and while future empires would build their own systems of control, none quite matched the psychological mastery of Persia's. It wasn't just that you might be watched. It was the feeling that truth itself was watching you, measuring your worth through unseen scales balanced in a sacred fire. So what was normal in ancient Persia? Civilization of brilliance, law, beauty, and an empire where loyalty was no longer an act of virtue, but one of survival, where being innocent was never enough. You had to appear innocent convincingly, constantly. In a world like that, silence wasn't golden. It was self-defense. And that's what truly horrifies us now. Not just the rituals or the punishments or the whispers, but the realization that, once upon a time, a great empire built its strength not on trust, but on the absence of it. So sleep well tonight, dear listener, and remember, you live in a world where privacy is a right. In ancient Persia it was a myth,